Hi, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to go over Spotify auth. So here I have a public playlist called My Playlist 1, and when I go back to my locally running React app, I have a button where I can log into Spotify, and then I can get the playlist, and it'll show the playlist that we were just looking at. And this button is also, I'm just going to show you generally what the data looks like. So this is real Spotify data from the Spotify API, and here's some data you can expect if you want to get playlists, but the API documentation for Spotify is really in-depth and there's a bunch of stuff that you can get. So this is just a sample of the data you might get. Okay, cool. So in this first part, for continuity purposes, I just wanted to show what I'm doing to refactor WebApp.css. Basically, I'm just adding some space up top. So nothing too crazy here. I just wanted to show this in case you're following along through the videos and you're wondering why does WebApp look different from my version. I think I ended up adding margin top of 30%. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is address this flashiness. So do you notice how the navigation bar kind of flickers like while it's getting the user? So why this matters today in this video is because it will impact our Spotify authorization flow. So I'm adding this in auth context.js. I'm basically adding an isLoading boolean, and I'm using this with the useState hook, and I'm giving it a default value of true. So I'm saying, okay, for in the beginning we are definitely loading our app because we're still getting the user from Firebase. We're still just establishing our data. So then in use effect, after we render, once we set the user, we can set is loading to false. And that will trigger, or let the rest of the app know, okay, we're done loading here. So last thing you need to do is export is loading. All right, and then I'm going to use the use auth hook in app.js. So here I'm just calling use auth, and I really only care about the isLoading boolean. So now I'm adding like a if statement. So if it is loading, then we're going to make a very basic loading indicator that just is a header one that says hold on loading. Else, then we want to render the rest of the app. So now if I refresh, it'll say hold on loading, and then render the rest of the DOM. All right, so now we can finally get to the Spotify configuration. Spotify has a lot of guides and information about authorization. If you're wondering which flow we're doing in this video, it is the implicit grant flow. Don't worry if this chart is just going straight over your head because it really went over mine too, but I'll open it up in a tab and we'll go through it step by step. But anyway, so in the authorization guide for Spotify, it's going to tell you to register your app. If you've already done this, please stay for the settings because this is really important for your application to work in terms of getting the user token after they log in. So I'm going to create my app, and then it should lead you to a screen like this. Go to edit settings, and the most important part here is the redirect URI. So this is where after authorization, it's going to tell Spotify, okay, where should I lead you next after your user logs in? So I'm just copying and pasting WebApp. If you have a different URL that you're trying to redirect to, then put it here, but do not miss this step. Okay, sorry, I'll stop nagging you. But okay, so we're finally done with that step. Here I am on the documentation for Spotify, and because in this tutorial you're not going to set up an express server or any sort of middleware, all we're doing is actually basically directing this user to a URL that looks like this. And it might look like just a bunch of gibberish right now, but what we're going to do is actually pry apart this URL and insert the values to make this work. So back in your dashboard for, your client ID or your app, I don't know why it keeps having this pop up. Oh, hold on, sorry, I have to log in. The dashboard have this value ready, and I feel like there's no good way of kind of doing this other than copying and pasting and prying it apart. So if we're going back to the graph, this is the step that we're at right now that we need to do. Request authorization to access data. Now, it is possible to get Spotify data without a user token, so without asking your user to log in. But for this tutorial, I'm deliberately going through the authorization flow. First, let's get the client ID out of the way, and this is your client ID. So the endpoint or URL is this one right here. It's accounts.spotify.com/authorize. So this is the base URL of where we're going to make this request. Now, if we look at this URL, you can see that there's a question mark, and then we start listing out some params. So client ID, we got that one. And then redirect URI is going to match the one that we put in settings over here from earlier on in the video. Next up is called scopes. So this array, and there's a link here in the documentation, is responsible for listing out whatever you want from your user. So if you want to get their playlist, you have to include it in the scope. Or if you want to get their listening history, like user top read, whatever that is, then you have to pass in this scope, and it is an array of strings. So for this app, I'm passing in user read currently playing and user read playback state, but I actually am able to get data about the user, like the playlist, without using these. Originally, I was interested in doing streaming, but then I realized that playback one doesn't work for accounts that don't have premium. So I just kind of left it, but I thought I'd include it in the tutorial in case this applies to you. Like you want to get, user read currently playing, like something like this. So anyway, I'll leave this here. And then if we go back to the sample URL that Spotify gave us, you can see that it's user read private, and then it's this delimiter right here, and this is like a space in the URL. So we're just going to use some JavaScript functions to keep these all in one string. And then I'm going to actually add a const for that one. Okay, so now you want to add a button that is going to attempt to redirect the user to this URL. So here I'm just adding a button with an on-click handler. And then we have to define handleLogin. And for this, we're going to use template literals to sort of insert these into the URL. So template literals start with a $sign and then some curly brackets. And here we have Spotify authorize endpoint. So we're doing that there. And then a question mark. And this is kind of tedious, so you can also just copy and paste it, but hopefully I don't mess any of this up. Okay, and then this is just kind of something we're adding that's not in a variable. So it's and response type equals token and show dialog is equal to true. Since we're just, making this one giant URL that we're redirecting, I feel like there's probably some way to make a helper function to kind of connect this all together and make it more readable. But anyway, I just wanted to show the general concept in this video. So here I'm going to click log into Spotify and let's see what happens. So it should, if you didn't do any typos or you copy and pasted from the code in the description, it should redirect you to the login page. Okay, so when I click on agree, I should be redirected back to WebApp. Okay, cool. So notice, interestingly, I need to fix this margin, that there's an access token that Spotify provides in the URL. So going back to here, we're kind of like at this stage. So we display scopes and prompt users to log in. We log in and we authorize access, and now we're here. We redirected the user to the application and passing the access token. The access token is in the URL. So this access token is now what we need. So our next step is to get the access token from the URL, as well as the token type and the expires in. And so what I'm going to do is actually store this as in localStorage. But you could do this in Firebase. There's like many ways to do this, but that is the general flow. So we're about halfway through. I'm now going to show you how to write the helper function to get that access token from here. So let's make a new helper function to get this token from the URL. I call this helper function get returned params from Spotify auth. I'm just going to copy the URL that we're expecting after a successful redirect. I know this does not handle the error state. The params in the URL, we are going to pass in the hash, which is starting from here. And then this line is getting it from here. So now we're just dealing with this. And then this one is now going to separate out when we have an ampersand. So over here, for example, and over here. And what we should get back is 3 variables: the access token, the token type, and the expires in. So what I just did in this function, now that we have everything from over here, I'm going to use a JavaScript function called reduce. And with reduce, you pass in the 2 parameters for the callback, and here are an accumulator and a current value. So the current value is going to be, here I'm just going to console.log the current value. Oh, we need to call it. Okay. Okay, to call this function, I'm going to use the useEffect hook. And this is similar to like component in mount. So I'm saying if window.location.hash, meaning we have a URL with some of this stuff in it, I'm just going to, for now, get return params from Spotify auth and pass in the window.location.hash. Here we can see what our current value is. So because we're calling reduce on params and URL, we have already split up the strings into what these look like. So this is the params and URL array. And then the accumulator is by default this empty object. And then we're adding items to the accumulator to return access token, token type, and expires in. Show what's going on here. This is what the end object looks like that's returned from get returns params from Spotify auth. So by the time we're done with our reduce function, then we will get an object that looks like this. But then if we wanted to use certain values from the object, we would have to do like object.accessToken, for example, if we wanted to get this value. So one way of not having to do that is by using something called destructuring. So we're actually going to use the syntax like this and then just say access token expires in and token type. I started typing and. So now I'm just printing out the access token, and you can see that we have the access token and the value. How we were able to do this is by using destructuring up here too, where we get the key and the value from this function, and then we're saying kind of mapping out to the accumulator object, okay, this is the key and then the value. And then down over here, we're just getting the key and the value. Anyway, I hope that kind of makes sense, because this is like using a lot of fancy syntax, and I feel like this function is kind of confusing, and I wish there were a better way to do it, but I feel like this is the cleanest that I could come up with. So there we go. We got our access token, we got our expires in, and we got our token type. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Here we are at this point. Now let's do something with this access token. Oh, by the way, let me explain some of this. So this expires in is saying this access token will expire in, I think it's like 36 milliseconds. I think that is the value. And then the token type, is something that I haven't figured out how to use, but it's called bearer. And the thing is, later when you use Axios or whatever to make a call to the Spotify web API, here in the authorization guide, they show you that you can kind of hard code bearer already, so you don't necessarily need this token type, but I thought I would just grab it anyway and store it in local storage. So you know, if you're at this point and you're thinking, I want to store this in Firebase, like, go for it. But I just kind of wanted to show, you know, what you could do with this value later. Local storage is definitely a temporary solution, but also these tokens seem to expire pretty quickly. So yeah, up to you how you feel about implementation. All right, so now we have stored our parameters in local storage. I think this is a good place to stop for this tutorial. So to review what we did, we basically authorized a Spotify login, and then we got a temporary access token, which we can then use in requests to the Spotify web API. So in the next video, I'll show you how you can call on the web API. Comment if you have any suggestions for material that you'd like to see, or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.